Okay, welcome everyone to the Remembering Mike Eisenberg panel. I am, well, I should begin by saying that this is a panel just devoted to remembering and celebrating the work and life of Mike Eisenberg, a really extraordinary scholar and researcher and just a person. My name is Leah Beakley. I'm an associate professor at the University of New Mexico. I'm joined with a wonderful group of folks who all knew Mike quite well. My co-host for this panel is Hunju Oh, who's a professor at Georgia Tech. We're joined also by Yasmin Kafai, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Sherry C., who's a principal scientist at BSCS Science Learning, and Mike Horn, who's an associate professor at Northwestern. Okay, if you could advance the slides, Ju. So can you go to the next slide, Ju? Maybe. I'm not seeing the next slide. Could you go one slide forward, Ju? Or maybe I can share my screen. Okay, I'm gonna.
You don't see the slide.
So I will do that.
Okay.
Okay, so here we go. So I wanted to start just honoring Mike before we get into talking about Mike's work and his life. I wanted to acknowledge that we're here to celebrate Mike, but we're also really here to celebrate his wonderful partnership with his wife and career-long collaborator, Ann Eisenberg. So they together kind of built and ran the craft technology group at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where Mike was a professor. And so Ann, I know that you're here today, and I just want to say, in honoring Mike, we also so honor you and your beautiful partnership and the work that you really did together. So there's so many extraordinary things about Mike. Everybody who knows Mike, of course, knows that he just was extremely knowledgeable. Gosh, sorry. I think I'm losing the screen share, sorry. So one of the extraordinary things about Mike was that he's just extremely knowledgeable about this amazing variety of fields. When I first met him as like a young person, I literally thought he just kind of knew everything. There seemed to be no end to like the depth of his knowledge. Of course, his knowledge of computer science and his knowledge of cognitive science, but also his knowledge of mathematics, his knowledge of literature, his knowledge of philosophy and topics like Greek and Norse mythology. He was someone who approached the world and human intellectual history with just kind of endless delight and fascination. And I've never met anyone who knew as much as Mike knew, kind of consumed knowledge with such joy, and then shared it so generously with others. So when I first came to Colorado, Mike had an enormous backpack that was full of books that he would cart everywhere around campus. And it's not an exaggeration to say that this backpack, I think, weighed like 50 or 60 pounds, and you'd see him hunched over, kind of trudging around campus. and finally persuaded him to trade it in for a suitcase. And then he could have like a whole suitcase of books that he like carted everywhere around campus with him, this wheeling suitcase. And on any given day, that suitcase might have like a book on materials science, a book with all of the laboratory notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, a book with like the collected mathematical papers of like John von Neumann, and a few popular science books, and maybe like the collected works of Shakespeare or something. So just that was something that was so striking and extraordinary about Mike. The other thing that I really wanted to share with all of you today, which I think is at the key of what made Mike such an exceptional scholar and also such an exceptional teacher and mentor, was, the best way I can frame it, his integrity. So first, his kind of deep intellectual integrity. And what I mean by that is that Mike was always kind of drawing on this enormous wealth of knowledge that he had to think very deeply about things that were meaningful and important to him in his own work, and then always doing the things, researching the things, thinking about the things that he really felt were beautiful, important, and kind of significant in this very large kind of intellectual frame. And it's taken me a while to appreciate how, although that seems like it would be a foundational core of academics and academia, it's actually quite rare that someone is able to think about things in such a broad scale and really carefully and deliberately and consistently work on projects that are important in that large scale. The other facet of Mike's integrity, and these things are all quite interconnected, is that I've never met anyone who so beautifully embodied his own intellectual philosophies. So Mike, in his kind of the delight and curiosity with which he approached the world, with which he approached learning, with which he approached like working with children, that was kind of a beautiful embodiment of the educational philosophy that he articulated. He really lived his own educational philosophy and kind of philosophy of life in an incredibly beautiful way, and then again, an incredibly unusual way. I feel like I learned so many things from Mike, being his student. But the thing that I learned the most over time, just kind of being around Mike, was that you could build a career, kind of an intellectual and academic career, that was really grounded in your own personal assessment of what is meaningful and important and beautiful and delightful in the world. And that was a valid and legitimate thing to do. And in fact, a wonderful thing to do. And the way that Mike kind of supported his, kind of followed his own passions and obsessions and interests, kind of embodied that. And then the way that he also genuinely kind of derived enormous joy out of his students' quirky and personal obsessions and passions and interests, was just so remarkable. And again, the best word that I can use to describe it is integrity. He had such integrity as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a teacher, and as a mentor. Okay, so with that, I want to quickly share just a couple of examples of the work that I've done that is really rooted in Mike and rooted in the craft technology group. I'm not going to talk about them long, but Mike was devoted to kind of blending technology and science and hands-on learning. My work in electronic textiles, in particular, the LilyPad Arduino project grew out of that. Similarly, the work that I and my students have been able to do in paper-based electronics was really rooted in Mike's fascination and interest in kind of new materials and new ways to help students learn. In particular, I know he was delighted and proud of the work of his grand student, Ji Chi, which I share her beautiful work here. So I'll hand that over to you, Ju, and let you share some of your thoughts about Mike.
Thanks, Leah. Maybe we can start from the previous slide. So I met Mike in 2013. Yeah, that slide. And at the very first meeting, he showed me this beautiful G and Leah's work at the High Low Tech Group. And that really opened my eyes regarding what paper and paper crafts can be like. And that certainly impacted our project, Paper Mechatronics, as well. Can you go next, please? So while working on Paper Mechatronics all together with Mike and Sherry Shi at the panel and Mark Gross at CEO Border, as well as myself, Mike really didn't speak up that much, in fact, what paper mechatronics should be like. But probably the only thing he really tried to push was framing paper mechatronics as a new medium instead of electrically, mechanically enhanced paper crafts as an extension of what's already there. He always preferred to introduce our project as an effort to enable a new medium, and highlighted how combining elements of mechanical design, electrical engineering, and computational thinking, how those combinations can be more than the sum of those in terms of creative learning opportunities as well as the technical challenges. And at the very bottom line of his vision was how we can invite more people, more children to explore this exciting complex new medium based on the existing rich and friendly culture of paper crafts. And that of his vision, I think, was evolved really over the time through many of his previous projects, developing technologies for beautiful and familiar crafting activities and approaching the crafts as a way to introduce more complex and abstract ideas. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. For instance, in this hypergami project, again with N, the lifelong project, they developed software to support exploring, creating a variety of polyhedra paper models. And then they presented those beautiful paper models and the overall activities as a sort of invitation to the subject of mathematics. So Annie is still continuing this project now using a 3D printer. So the material options are broadened while the core of the idea still remains. And you can see in another similar context, maybe in the next slide, the pop-up workshop. This project also created software, I think it was around like 15 years ago, to explore and design pop-up structures. And in that project, children design their own pop-up geometry with 3D rendering in the screen and downloaded the templates to cut and make the physical models. And with those work, in his, back that time, 15 to 20 years ago, in his paper, he discussed using computational tools, now children can make far more complex, expressive, and beautiful educational crafts. So that's where his passion, the lifelong passion was. And then maybe next slide. Mathnosphere, again, it really showed well his consistent passion about expressive and hands-on making activities to explore mathematical concepts. And in this project, children started from crafting materials and then programmed using a web-based logo-like programming environment they built. And children designed their own sphere and then displayed it in the museum installation, which could also become a source of inspiration and another invitation for other children in the museum. And then finally, Mike himself enjoyed making a lot of beautiful geometric sculptures as his hobby. I think basically he loved all sorts of mathematical recreations. And he loved how abstract mathematical concepts can be visualized, materialized in such an aesthetic way. So now, as I close this opening remark, just introducing a bit of what he has built all his life, I wanted to share his last word to his PhD students. He left this message by email through Anne before he passed away. He believed making beautiful things can be a compelling means to make this world a better place. And I think his word would resonate not only us, his students, but also many others, including here, of course, panelists, and many of you in this FabLearn community. So with that, now I want to open up a conversation with the panelists. You have all worked with Mike in a variety of ways. Can you describe the influence Mike had on your work? How you think about his impact on your work in learning, technology, and design? Maybe we can start from Yasmin, please.
Sure. This was very moving, especially the last sentence. And I think we're also fortunate that we had Cynthia Solomon's keynote just last hour, which really sets the stage, because I met Mike in the early 1990s at the MIT Media Lab when he still was a graduate student. And I'm putting this in the chat now because Mike early on has really been concerned on how we interface with the computer. This is a very famous AI memo. I think this actually became his dissertation later on. And he often came to meetings at the MIT Media Lab, even though he wasn't a student there, to present his ideas to Seymour and the group on how logo should be designed. So it was actually a follow-up on what Cynthia had said. And were very interesting discussions. Seymour and Mike didn't really align, but there was once, at the end, a very typical Mike statement. He said, with Seymour, you can tinker in logo, but you cannot tinker with logo. Was kind of his level of upsetness with Seymour on, what kind of interfaces we needed to create to really enhance the expressiveness for kids with things. And I have been fortunate over the last 10, 15 years to work with Mike, Leah, and Kylie on kind of taking electronic textiles and bringing it into classrooms, and to show that these kind of maker activities really can have a space in a curriculum infused with considerations of equity and really bringing in all students, giving them an opportunity to engage in computing, really in the spirit of Mike, of kind of showcasing what you said, beauty, personal expression in connection with computational ideas. And in the last grant, where unfortunately he passed away, but now Anne is on board and Mark Rose, it brought back something which Cynthia just said, she said there were so many debugging tools which have disappeared, and I didn't realize that, unknowingly, I have to admit, we're kind of now working on bringing them back. And I know there's a whole other group in Austria and other places who are kind of connecting to Mike's obsession, not just to kind of work with different media, but really coming back to his dissertation, interface meets interpreter, on how we create expression, not just in media, but on also how we facilitate how people can make in interfacing with computational tools. So I leave it there and hand it over to Sherry or Mike.
I'd be happy to speak. I want to tell a story about how I met Mike. I've always known about Mike's work. He was working on this origami, Javagami tool, which Hyunju had showed a little bit of, where you do some editing online and you create these foldables, and then you can get inspired to go back and then make more. And so this is a really nice cycle. And I was at the Exploratorium for about 7 years and recently moved to the Lawrence Hall of Science and was in Boulder, Colorado for this meeting. And very much kind of inspired by Mike, I was sitting in this meeting thinking, this is absolutely dreadful. Like, this can't be where education is going. So I left the meeting and I picked up the phone and I said, you don't know me, but I'm Sherry Shih and I'm on campus. Can I come visit your lab? And he and Anne were there and said, great, come on over. And we started this conversation about these giant spheres and how screens were being used in multiple places, not just in classrooms, to lecture, and what a loss that was. And he started talking about how, where is constructionism? Where is it going? And then told a story about how he was so excited about 3D geometry. And how is it that you can't fold a piece of paper and wrap it on an orange without it getting wrinkled, right? That was just this, like, do you ever try to wrap something and there's got these little wrinkles? And that's sort of where this started, with our just dissatisfaction with, the state of education. And in that little cup of coffee, we had said, I bet, what would if we hacked something? What if we gave kids the power, the agency and interest to customize and hack things on their own? And that's sort of where the Mathonosphere project came up. And so this became this really wonderful collaboration that started, I think, in 2007, where Mike and I would just chat. We would talk about, as Leah had said, he would say, oh, I was reading this Belgian poet the other day, just really out of my own league. Or, I had this really interesting book and I was going back and looking at Mathland, or I was really thinking about these things. And we'd have these conversations that would just lead to projects that we'd want to work on, which is sort of where paper mechatronics came from. Where I come in from this engineering tradition where, you have learning objectives and you have standards and you have goals and you want to design for phenomena and practices. And he was like, no, Sherry, no, it's like, where is the joy? Where is the joy in this? And what is the emotion that you want someone to have when they've experienced it for themselves through making, and also for the person who's receiving it? It's very much in the constructionist tradition to do this public display. There's a celebration of your art in a public space. And he said, yeah, you've got to work on the evocativeness. What's the evocative potential of this particular medium? And that's really the goal of the design, right? The design isn't about, yes, I know we have funding from NSF and we've got to, get these objectives. That's important, but it's really important to the individual to feel that they want to keep doing this. They want to keep making beautiful objects in the world. And that level of engagement and interest is really important. And so I feel that the influence that Mike has had on my work is to not think too much in a disciplinary way, to really erase the disciplinary boundaries and really start with, where is this kid? Where is their mind? Where are their feelings? And where do they want to go? And that kind of iteration, that movement towards some expertise or skill that kid wants to do, or some messaging, is really what's important about the design. I'll hand it over to Mike.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here to share. It's really nice to have the chance to do so. It's, for me, very hard to overstate the influence that Mike and his students have had on my thinking and my career. The first academic conference that I ever went to was in 2005, the Interaction Design in Children Conference in Boulder, Colorado, that Anne and Mike were the general chairs for. and at that time, I was at a very traditional CS department, very button up, you know, and I felt this real sense of almost like despair or like self-doubt, because essentially what I was doing was making children's toys, and I kept, you know, was crushed by the sense of like, no one is ever going to get me a PhD for making children's toys, you know, things that you can hold and experience. And going to IDC in 2005 was just like this trip into academic wonderland to see Mike's lab and just to experience that, you know, just the artifacts in that space and how they communicated on their own, the sense of playfulness and wonder. That conference was amazing. Edith Ackerman was there, Mitch Resnick and his students were there, Allison Druin and her students were there. Yasmin, I think you were the doctoral consortium chair. Leah, I think, was the photography and publicity chair that year. Narcisse Perez, Janet Reed, Paolo and Dor had a poster, I think. Mark Gross was there, Andy Rubin, Vaughn Rogers. It was just this, you know, you can imagine, I had no idea, like I came from a small place, and coming into this space where all of these thinkers had come together with I think a very common vision that in many ways was shaped by Mike's thinking, was amazing for me. And in the years after that, you know, Mike was always so generous, reaching out and talking to you, and just, you know, supporting someone who was just getting started, treating you like a colleague and inviting you into conversation, Sherry, like you were saying. It was just quite impactful for me. I think Mike, more than anyone, asked us to inhabit the world of a child, to live and sit with the wonder that a child feels in the world and the emotional space of a child's room. And just, yeah, to live in that wonder, and to live in the beauty of childhood. And that was, yeah. And that, it really, yeah, again, it's hard to overstate how much that event and that sort of getting to know Mike and his work gave me the confidence to keep going with my PhD.
I also, Mike, remember that event so well and so fondly. I also, around the similar time, was very seriously considering dropping out of the PhD, and had a quite similar experience to you, engaging with Mike in a deep way. And anyway, I didn't know those things, but that's wonderful to learn about that. So I wanted to ask you all a second question. So that's more about Mike's influence on like the larger world and the larger communities that we're part of. So if you walk into like a science museum or a maker space or a school today, you're likely to see kids like tinkering with things like paper circuits or cardboard mechanisms and paper mechanisms like electronic textiles or mathematical origami. Can you reflect a bit on how Mike's work has influenced the way we and our community kind of thinks about STEM education and kind of STEAM education? And let's, I guess let's go, Yasmin. Let's go.
All right. Now,
Order.
I think Mike has really taught me to pay attention to the non-obvious. And one thing I can concretely remember, especially with maker spaces, Mike once made this observation, you know, there's always kind of some interesting conversation and murmur going on when people are crafting and making. And it's not your typical kind of STEM conversation, you know, as educators, we would say, are people talking about the content, you know, about computation? And he said, no, there's something else going on, something very deeply personal, sometimes very casual. And then once in a while, people would kind of talk about, you know, how do you make this? Why doesn't it work? And I'm still struck by this observation because we focus so much in education, are people on task, are people on learning, that we often forget that this is something very compelling and interesting and part of learning we're just not paying attention to. And he was always, such an astute observer in helping, I mean, I think all of us to direct our attention to the parts of learning which people usually don't pay attention to because we're so obsessed with STEM. And you know, I'm still puzzling about this. What is the meaning of this? And I know that everybody appreciates this. Teachers talk about on how students are talking and the sharing and how important this is, and we still don't really value it fully. So I would invite everybody to kind of, you know, adopt once in a while a Mike Eisenberg stance and kind of just look, what are we missing out, what we're not listening to, what we're not seeing in when we're kind of looking at making. And you know, pay attention next time you go into a maker space. I mean, not just, I mean, in the circuits which are being crafted and coded, but what else is going on and how can that be informative for understanding, learning, tool design, and everything else?
Sherry or Mike, care to share your thoughts on that question?
The word that you mentioned, tinkering, I think is really important. This idea that there is no structured time required in the way that school is structured. And back to my, you know, transdisciplinary notions of Mike's work, that Mike's influence on STEAM education is this idea that you can spend as much time as you like on an idea, and there's no right or wrong. And you can spend a lot of time just kind of gluing toothpicks together, and it's okay. And it's okay to not understand something and be with other people in this intergenerational way, whether or not you're trying to have a child explain something to you or you're explaining something to a peer. I'm going to tell another story as I was reflecting on what I was going to say today, that Mike was invited to the Tinkering Studio to be part of a video series for this movie. And as you know, Mike gets very deep into ideas and oftentimes will read a book and not be really good about time. And so my job was to get him into a car and get him to the Exploratorium so he could be part of this session. And I was having one of these horrible mornings where my youngest son decided he didn't want to have breakfast. He didn't want to go to school. He didn't want to put his shoes on. It was just one of these, like, looking at the clock, trying to get him out the door. And, you know, I said, Mike, you know, I'm having an incredibly difficult morning. And he said, bring him along. You know, he doesn't need to go to school, right? This is school. This is what learning is about. It's about, you know, just experiencing the world in a particular way. And I threw him in the car and just, you know, it's a precious moment to have, you know, watching my son and at the tinkering team and Mike in this space, this incredible space at the Exploratorium, where you have 650 exhibits, but it doesn't matter. You could spend 3 hours doing one thing, you know, pushing a little piece of sand around. And I think that when you think about, you know, how we think about STEAM education as in a time that we're moving to COVID, where we're trying to take a lot of the practices and structures of schooling into this online world unnecessarily. So underscoring what Yasmin said about kind of rethinking education and taking the nuggets of what's important in learning and trying to hold on to that, even if the medium shifts under you and it's this online learning, that we've got to rethink teaching science, technology, engineering, math, arts, or it's an influence of arts, but really think of, you know, what's the, I heard it in Cynthia Solomon's talk this morning about, you know, project-based learning. talking about working in a team, and in the wonderful team that she was in, to build things and make them tinkerable and changeable to accept the narratives of what kids want to say or do, like helping kids bring out their voices and stories, which is not, it's transdisciplinary in that way.
I'm really glad that you asked a question about that kind of started with museums, because it reminded me of Mike once told me a story about his kind of childhood and adolescence, about kind of being a free range child who could kind of just explore on his own, and one of the things that he would do often, or at least this is the story that he told me, was he would just go to the Natural History Museum, and it was free, and he would just walk in and explore, and it was no one was telling him to go to the Natural History Museum. It wasn't part of like a trip with his parents. That was just where he wandered in his free range childhood. And I think what I feel like I've learned in a sense is from Mike is that STEM, they're meaningless without wonder. Tinkering as an end in itself. There's this quote from a paper that Mike wrote, Mind Stuff, which if you haven't read, you need to read immediately. But he wrote, the youngster described in Pappert's introduction, after all, fell in love with objects, things that could be handled, touched, smelled, placed on a shelf or in one's pocket, collected, traded, and decorated. Individual gears themselves may not change shape, but a child in love with gears can build toys with them, line them up on bookshelves, maybe hang them from the ceiling. And it was just, so I think this idea of wonder and just emotional engagement, and I mean, for me, like the whole idea of craft and tinkering and STEM and STEAM and maker spaces all comes back to this, that for me, put beautiful things in the world, like it resonates with me so much. And I think that's really, so if I were to say like, this is the influence I'm seeing in Mike now and looking at museums and how museums are changing, much taking a lead from the Exploratorium and other places, but that's the idea that I think is I see resonating.
Thank you all so much for your thoughts. At this point, we'd like to invite questions from the audience. If you have any questions you'd like to pose to us, like please use the Q&A forum to ask them, and then in a minute we'll get to those. Also, you can use the Q&A feature to vote on questions that you would like us to answer. So please do that. While you are asking questions there, I'll turn that question to you, Ju, and ask you what you think of as like Mike's influence both on in the academic community, but also out in the larger world. How do you see that?
Well, I think really what you guys mentioned already like a beautifully covered what was his lifelong passion. He always talked about wonder at the first place, and of course in the proposal in the paper, very published things, we need to talk about a certain disciplinary manner, certain things in the manner, but he always emphasized that at the end of it, what is really the driving power when we see those who invented things that have changed the world, those who we call like genius, like where how they became who they were, what was the driving power, that there's something, those are related to something we call wonder, curiosity, and how we can design an activity, how we can develop things that can, invite those sense. I think that's what he really tried to push, and that's what really remains in my heart as I continue my career in academia.
Thank you, Ju. Just to build on what kind of everybody has also said, one thing that I feel like I learned so much from Mike. I should just to back up a little bit. When I first joined Mike's lab, Mike and Ann's lab, as a student, I was not especially interested in education, frankly. So I was interested in making beautiful things kind of with technology. But I felt like education was kind of dry and dull and just like rehashing, stuff that had gone before. It wasn't where like the exciting forefront of things happened, right? So I was delighted and inspired by the craft technology lab. And I felt like, okay, I have to do this education stuff to get to do all the cool things that the lab is doing otherwise, right? And what I slowly kind of deeply absorbed over time is that is the view that I had of education is I think, an implicit dominant view that education kind of comes after the fact, or that learning is somehow separated from the rest of life, that it is a rehashing of old knowledge or something. And what I learned so vividly from Mike and working with him is that, learning is the stuff of life. And when children and adults are engaged in thinking deeply about things, when they are engaged in making things, like they are engaged in like being a human being. They are engaged in like some of the most important, like essential activities of being a person, and that learning is this integral part of life. It's not separate, and that it's not an afterthought. It can ideally be an integral part of like cutting edge, like science and engineering research, right? Those things can happen all at the same time, mashed up together. So just the integration of learning with the rest of life, and respecting learners as human beings who are on like an epic journey to discover themselves, to discover the world. Like there's no more magical process to be a part of. And I feel so like humbled and chagrined that I had such a backwards kind of perspective when I first started out working with Mike. So I think we have a couple of good questions here in the chat. I'll post one of them from Danny Edelson. He says, how do you account for Mike becoming Mike in a world that didn't value or cultivate childlike wonder?
I can start with that question, and then if someone could add to that. So science inquiry is something that folks in science education have been trying to do for a long time and do it well. And I think when you see really good science inquiry happening, it is with really rich materials, it's with tools, it's with objects. And back to this idea that that Mike instilled in us is that the medium matters, right? In the case of Paper, the medium was the paper. And then in Logo, it's the bits and atoms. It's like, what is the, maybe it's clay. It's what's the thing that you're shaping? And I think when you have really good inquiry and you have a process where you are inviting wonder and curiosity, and you're inviting students and children to ask their own questions, which I think is a fundamental tenet of inquiry, then I think you're starting to move in that direction. But someone else should add to that.
But I think Mike also taught us to look in the places we wouldn't look otherwise, you know. So he has done so much work in the kind of, you know, Leah, you named your group low tech, kind of in those materials which had kind of fallen out of favor, and to kind of elevate them again. So I think, you know, part of the wonderment comes, you didn't expect to connect crafting and computing. You know, you didn't expect to make things of paper mechanical. And I think that opens up eyes and wonderment to see materials and media in a different way. And we don't often think about enough. I mean, what creates wonder, you know, are those crazy juxtapositions, but was also very simple material that it doesn't have to be high tech. Okay, the big screens were really high tech, but they were also kind of quite wonderful on how Mike thought about rethinking interactions with them and what the viewers can do. So he always had this kind of, you know, let's kind of, you know, present a different approach.
Benny, I have no idea, like your question about like, how did Mike become Mike, you know, and my sense is people, you know, he had time and freedom and, you know, space, and, you know, was it sort of, maybe it was inevitable, but like, I don't know, you know, that's a really fantastic question. I think what you're asking is how do Mikes of today become Mikes despite the, you know, constraints that we put around and on childhood. And I think that that's a really a super important question.
You know, he had a father who loved poetry. He was also the director, I think, of the Rockefeller of a research lab. And so he had an early introduction, which didn't just say computer science is everything. I mean, literature and arts are equally important. And we all know the famous lore of Mike writing a screenplay and selling it to Hollywood to finance his graduate studies. Nobody would think about it this way. I mean, how you finance your graduate studies in computer science. But you know, that I think we don't make enough room for what people consider these really odd and maybe sometimes unproductive connections. And Mike, I mean, I think supported from home, found a very supportive environment for that.
I want to pose one more question. I'm going to try to mash up a few of the different questions we're getting in the Q&A. So this is kind of a mashup of Astrid, Stefania, and Nathan's questions, which is, so I'll start with a chunk of Nathan. So Mike seemed to want to give kids like a lot of time to think, to explore, to pursue lunatic passions. In education, there's a lot of pressure for efficiency. How can we think about like ways to give time to kids in their work, and also how do we give ourselves time in our own work? And adding a bit on in similar spirit though, kind of how can we help ourselves and others kind of see and create wonder, and how can we, I don't know, keep at the forefront of our minds, like the wonderful lessons that we've learned from Mike.
I was thinking about maker spaces and fab labs, and I would imagine that people, teachers and students, lose a lot of time looking for materials. Like I need that tool, and it takes a lot of time to set things up and grab things. And, you know, having this open palette, like what does it mean to have an open palette of materials, even digital materials that you could go in and have access to? And I feel like that in a sense, that readiness buys you more time for the fun thinking and the wondering that happens, rather than the, you know, I can't really think because I can't find a pen, or there isn't a piece of paper, or or the 3D printer has been jammed with, the thing, that like there's sort of like this failures that happen, but you really want this sense of fluidity and flow to enable that to happen. I don't know how to do that like in education, in these really weird times that we're in. But know that, resources are important.
Yeah.
I think we have to give up on the notion that we can teach everything. Maybe 100 years ago, somebody could read all the books and cover everything, but that is no longer possible. So rather than to go for a thin curriculum, why not focus on activities? And I know when we designed the electronic textile unit for exploring computer science, we just decided it will take several weeks. And you know what, teachers actually don't mind. I think they get enough out of it, and the students as well. And we have documented that also, that they feel this is time well spent for students to kind of get an introduction. I have to say though, however, I still remember vividly in one of the portfolios at the end, one of the students wrote, "Oh, and I learned in this project on how to mend my own clothes." And I said, wow, you just spent a whole year on computer science, but then, so little what happens in a classroom transfers out. And nowadays we all know sewing masks has become an essential skill. So if not the computer science, something else kind of moved over. And I think Mike was really good in admonishing us. I mean, not to cave into those pressures and to find ways inside and outside of school to create the space, to create the room and materials, because he felt, I think rightfully so, in the long run, I mean, this kind of creates to better engagement in learning and with science.
I'll just very quickly say, I think Mike gave us a hint to this answer in the word craft and the emphasis on craft. And Yasmin and Leah, you know this well, like craft is not efficient, and it's not supposed to be efficient, and that's the beauty of it. And yet we still find it valuable in society and culture. And I think that there's learning in that inefficiency that's vital. So that's all I wanted to add to that.
I wanted to clarify, when I said resource, I also appreciate Claudia posted this thing that a comment about communities are also supports. And so other humans, right, which is things that you find in these wonderful spaces like Fab Labs and maker spaces, is that community that is also a resource.
I wanted to share just very briefly, Mike, what you just said brought to mind something that Mike would often say, like the clarinet is like this bizarre kind of extremely difficult to learn instrument. But the clarinet is an amazing thing that like gave rise to like, Benny Goodman and other amazing musicians. And that doesn't mean that everybody should learn to play the clarinet, but it does mean the clarinet is like this amazingly wonderful pathway for many people to be spectacularly creative and to do amazing things. I love that analogy. I wonder, Ju, if you had any thoughts, any last thoughts about that question before we kind of move into a conclusion, or other thoughts?
Well, I think just briefly how Mike and Anne formed the culture and the space in the Craft Tech Lab. It really showed well. We had the tradition, like having no rules and like full of resources and full of free time, and he never ever really asked us anything almost, and that often honestly frustrated me. And that a lot of free time, because we had other colleagues really certainly having weekly meeting, like certain duties, but we had nothing really to follow. And that ended up an amazing blessing, but it took for a while, and at least for me, to really enjoy and to take that advantage. But throughout the whole time, it was kind of, I learned that it was intended culture. He always was available when we requested his, attention or time. But it was just not that he asked us first. He thought that openness, that freedom, that flexibility was the key, I believe. I think that was the culture and philosophy, if I say the craft tech lab built.
As we're closing, MIT Press gave us a permission to share an interview with Mike. For some reason, it's not on the website, but so I'll take the liberty. I put it up as a Google Doc since I have the proofs, and put it in the chat so you can all download the copy. I did it already earlier. So, and the whole book, which Nathan Holbert and Matthew Berlin, we put together a table of content is here. You can go to MIT Press, but I think they allowed us to share and we'll make a copy of Mike's interview, which, he was very eager to kind of share his thoughts on, remember the last FabLearn keynote he gave where he surprised us all on thinking about the next frontier for making the body. I think nobody would have expected to come that from Mike, but that again was also so typical of him, to really kind of look for places where we could expand the kind of maker activities and thinking.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for sharing that. There are also several links that have been posted in the chat to other wonderful resources, but that's so great. Ju and I have a couple of announcements to close. So thank you all so much for participating in the panel. We'll say, make a couple of announcements and then say goodbye. Sorry, this is like unexpected tech ridiculousness to close on. Probably there are kind of two important announcements. One is that some of Mike Eisenberg's colleagues at the University of Colorado have started a memorial fund for Mike. So that effort is led by Liz Bradley and Brian LaMacchia. They're attempting to raise funds to install one of these beautiful, whimsical marble ball machines in the engineering center at the University of Colorado. So please, if you can, we ask you to donate to that fund so that the students can have this experience and this memory of Mike. Get in touch with Liz or Brian if you have any questions about that. And then we also wanted to announce that starting this year, this conference will begin awarding a Mike Eisenberg Award for beautiful learning technology, kind of inspired by those last words that he sent to his students that Ju shared. So this will be the first year that the conference awards this award, and we will be doing that tomorrow morning as part of the opening conference ceremony. So please join us for that ceremony. And again, another little mini celebration of Mike tomorrow morning. So thank you all so much again. I know we miss and love Mike so much. I feel myself so grateful to have had a chance to work with him and to know him. It's been a pleasure sharing these memories and thoughts with all of you. Thank you, everyone, and hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Apologies for my technical glitches. I'm sorry I couldn't see your screen at the beginning, Ju. I think the panelists are still.
Oh, no worries, Leah. No, I mean, I kind of had some issues hearing what you talked at the beginning, so I wanted to somehow connect the way you talk, but I just couldn't hear that well.
Okay.
I
Okay.
hope it was that there was no not that much jump.
It's probably just like technical things. Thanks so much, Mike. It was so beautiful to hear your thoughts, and I don't know, they really resonated. It was really great.
Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you, everyone. Is this link